3 days after I buried my husband of 41 years, my daughter-in-law walked into my boardroom and slid a document across the table, the kind that was designed to take everything Richard and I had spent 4 decades building. She thought grief had made me fragile. She thought a 63-year-old widow with a broken heart was an easy target. What she didn't know was that my husband had left me a warning. What none of them knew was that a toxicity report, a DNA result, and a federal investigation were already in motion. By Friday morning, every one of them would be in handcuffs. Thank you for being here, truly. Now tell me something. Where in the world are you watching this? Drop your city or country in the comments below. You would be amazed how far these stories travel. Please note this story includes fictional elements added for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real names or locations is purely coincidental. The message, however, is one I hope stays with you. The boardroom smelled like grief and ambition. 2 things I had spent 40 years learning never to mix. I walked in at exactly 9 in the morning. Monica was sitting in Richard's chair. She had arranged herself with the practiced ease of someone who had been rehearsing this moment for a very long time. Her black dress was designer. Her expression was a careful performance of sorrow that did not reach her eyes. Derek sat beside her, hands folded on the table, like a man who had memorized a script and was praying he wouldn't forget it. When I walked in, he looked up for exactly 2 seconds, then looked back down at his hands. My own son could not hold my gaze. Maggie Cole was standing at the credenza along the wall, setting out the morning coffee with hands that weren't entirely steady. She had been Richard's personal secretary for 15 years. She knew how he took his coffee. She had cried harder at his funeral than Monica had. When she placed my cup in front of me, her eyes found mine, red-rimmed, frightened, desperate to say something she couldn't find words for. I gave her the smallest nod I could manage. Monica slid a thick folder down the length of the table. It stopped in front of me with a soft, deliberate thud. Emergency Succession and Transfer Agreement. Clean, bold letters. Someone had spent real money on the legal language inside. It transfers executive authority into a family trust, Monica said smoothly. Chase as primary beneficiary. Derek and I manage daily operations. It's what Richard would have wanted: stability for the company, peace of mind for you. Derek reached across and placed his hand over mine. The gesture was warm, practiced, hollow. "You've carried so much, Mom," he said softly. "Let us carry this now. You deserve to rest." I looked at his hand on mine and heard Richard's voice from 3 nights ago, 2 in the morning, his fingers ice cold around mine, his breathing thin and labored. "Evelyn, don't trust." And then silence. And then paramedics. And then a doctor half my age telling me my husband of 41 years was gone. I pulled my hand away from Derek's. "I'll need a few days to review this with my attorney," I said. "No signature without independent legal review." Richard insisted on that. "So do I." Something moved behind Monica's eyes, fast and hot, gone before anyone else would have caught it. Then the smooth mask settled back into place. "Of course," she said. "Friday works perfectly." I buttoned my blazer and picked up the folder. In the doorway I paused, not because I'd forgotten anything, but because I had learned long ago that what people do when they think you're no longer watching tells you everything. I didn't turn around, but the glass panel beside the door reflected the room perfectly. Monica had already leaned across the table toward Derek, her hand on his arm, her lips close to his ear, smiling. Not the performance smile from this morning, a real one, small, sharp, and certain of victory. I walked to the elevator alone. The doors closed. My reflection stared back at me from the polished steel, a 63-year-old woman in a black blazer holding a document someone was very eager for her to sign. "Don't trust." My phone buzzed. Unknown number, local area code. Mrs. Sterling, careful voice, measured. The voice of a man practiced at delivering difficult news. "This is Dr. James Whitfield, Richard's physician. I'm sorry to call so soon, but there's something in Richard's blood work I need you to see in person. Today, if possible." I stood in the lobby of the building Richard and I had built from nothing and felt something settle in my chest. Not grief, something colder, sharper, more dangerous than grief. "I can be there in 20 minutes, I said. Dr. Whitfield's office smelled like old books and antiseptic, the smell of a man who had delivered bad news so many times it had soaked into the walls. He was waiting for me when I arrived. No small talk, no condolences beyond a brief, genuine press of his hand over mine. He slid a single-page authorization form across his desk before he said anything else. "As Richard's legal heir and estate representative, you have the right to access his medical records," he said. I need your signature before I can show you this." I signed without hesitation. He opened a manila folder and turned it toward me. Richard had been a creature of routine quarterly checkups, same lab panel every 90 days, same clinic for 16 years. The most recent blood sample had been drawn 11 weeks ago and stored according to standard protocol. Dr. Whitfield had ordered a secondary analysis 2 days ago after something in Richard's chart had refused to leave him alone. "Cardiac glycoside compounds," he said, keeping his voice careful and precise. "Specifically elevated digitalis markers. In high concentrations, digitalis causes the heart muscle to seize. It mimics a natural cardiac event almost perfectly, unless you're specifically looking for it, and most emergency physicians don't, because there's no reason to suspect it. It doesn't show up." I looked at the numbers on the page. I was not a doctor, but I had spent 4 decades reading financial reports, and I knew what an anomaly looked like regardless of the field. "You're telling me someone put this in his system," I said. Dr. Whitfield didn't answer immediately. "I'm telling you the levels are inconsistent with any medication Richard was prescribed. What that means is a question for someone with a different kind of expertise than mine." I folded the report, tucked it into my bag, and thanked him. I sat in the clinic parking lot and let the weight of it settle over me. My hands were shaking against the steering wheel, my vision blurred at the edges. Richard's voice was in my ears, "Don't trust," and for a moment the grief and the rage arrived at exactly the same time, and I could not tell them apart. Then I pulled the keys from my ignition, took one long breath, and drove to Sterling Logistics. I had work to do. The building felt different in the afternoon, quieter, more exposed. I took the elevator to the executive floor and walked to Richard's office. The door was unlocked, which it should not have been. I stepped inside. The bottom drawer of his desk, the one he kept locked, always the one even I had only been inside twice in 40 years, was standing open. The files inside had been moved, not ransacked, not destroyed, carefully, methodically searched by someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and didn't want it to appear disturbed. Someone had been here before me. I was still standing at the desk when I heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, the walk of a man who had something urgent to say and not much time to say it. Thomas Briggs appeared in the doorway. He was 55 years old and had been Sterling Logistics Vice President of Operations for 2 decades. Monica had handed him a severance package 48 hours after Richard's funeral, citing restructuring. He was still clearing out his office down the hall. He looked both ways before he stepped inside and pulled the door nearly shut behind him. "Mrs. Sterling," he kept his voice low and pressed a folded piece of paper into my hand. "I printed this before they locked me out of the system. Derek has been buying shares. Minority stockholders, 5 of them in the last 48 hours. He's acquired 12%. If he gets to 30, he can call a shareholder vote without your approval." I unfolded the paper. The numbers were clean and precise and deeply deliberate. This had not happened by accident. Derek had started making calls before Richard was in the ground. "Thank you, Thomas," I said quietly. "Take the severance. Go home. Don't say a word to anyone." He nodded once tightly and left. I stood alone in Richard's office, the drawer hanging open beside me. Dr. Whitfield's report in my bag, Thomas's printout in my hand. 3 separate threads pulled from 3 separate directions, all pointing toward the same place. I went home. I walked straight to our bedroom, to the framed wedding photograph on the wall. The one from 1982, Richard in a rented tuxedo, me in my mother's altered dress, both of us laughing at something the photographer had said. The frame was slightly crooked. I had straightened that frame every week for 40 years. I lifted it off the wall. Taped to the back, pressed flat against the drywall, was a small white envelope, Richard's handwriting on the front. No name, just 2 words. For Evelyn. My hands were not steady when I opened it. The note was 11 words long. Monica, B. Jenkins, Westbrook College, 2009. Do not sign anything. R. I read it 4 times, standing in our bedroom, the wedding photograph propped against the wall beside me, Richard's handwriting blurring slightly at the edges, because my eyes were doing something I had not allowed them to do since the paramedics left our house 4 days ago. I had known. Whatever he had discovered, whatever thread he had begun pulling, he had known enough to hide this and to warn me. He had died with the warning still in his throat, and he had left it here behind the photograph of the 2 of us laughing in 1982, because he knew I straightened that frame every single week. 41 years of marriage, and he still knew exactly where to find me. I sat down on the edge of the bed, 60 seconds. I gave myself 60 seconds. I pressed Richard's note against my chest, closed my eyes, and let the grief come the way it had been waiting to since the moment the doctor spoke. It came hard and fast, and it took my breath. My shoulders shook. My throat burned. 60 seconds. Then I stood up, smoothed my jacket, and went to make coffee. I had work to do, and Richard had not married a woman who stayed on the floor. By 8 in the morning, I was at Sterling Logistics. I had a reason for coming documents in Richard's office that legitimately needed my attention. But what I was really doing was watching, and what I saw from the window of the second-floor corridor made my stomach turn cold. Monica had taken Chase to the company's private pool on the east side of the property. I could see them from where I stood. Chase accepting a bottle of sports drink from her before diving in strong and easy in his strokes. But within minutes his movements slowed, his legs cramping violently as he fought to stay afloat. Monica sat at the pool's edge, perfectly dressed, scrolling through her phone. I watched her reach out with one foot and nudge the rescue hook, the long aluminum pole mounted on the pool fence, so that it swung away from the edge and clattered to the ground on the far side of the enclosure. Chase went under. It happened quickly and quietly, the way real emergencies always do. Not dramatic, not loud, just a boy who was suddenly not where he had been. Monica did not look up for 4 full seconds. When she did, she stood slowly, the way a person stands when they are performing concern rather than feeling it. Officer Danny Walsh came around the east corner of the building at a dead run. He was one of our property security officers, 35 years old, former lifeguard before he joined the team. He cleared the pool fence in one motion and was in the water before Monica had taken 2 steps toward the edge. He pulled Chase up, sputtering and gasping, got an arm under him and hauled him to the ladder. Chase grabbed the railing and dragged himself out, coughing water, his face white and confused. Monica rushed forward, then her hand on Chase's back, her voice pitched at exactly the right frequency of maternal alarm. I turned away from the window before she could look up and see me watching. It was only later that I understood her reasoning. Chase had been asking questions recently, small ones, the kind a 15-year-old asks, without understanding what they reveal. Questions about why he looked nothing like Derek, about blood types, about family resemblance. To Monica, a curious boy with the wrong answers inside him was a risk she had decided she could not afford to carry into Friday's board meeting. I found Chase an hour later, sitting on a bench in the courtyard outside the building, his hair still damp, a company-branded towel around his shoulders. I sat down beside him without saying anything about what I had seen. Some things a 15-year-old boy does not need to carry. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Better." He glanced at me sideways. "Grandma, are you okay? You look like you're thinking very hard about something." "I'm always thinking hard about something," I said. "It's a bad habit." He almost smiled. "Grandpa used to say that about you. Your grandfather was usually right." We walked together after that through the courtyard and along the paved path that ran beside the building's north face. It was a route Richard and I had walked 100 times. Chase fell into step beside me, his hands in his pockets, quiet in the easy way of someone comfortable with silence. "Did Grandpa love this building?" he asked suddenly. "He loved what it stood for," I said. "He used to say the building was just concrete and glass. The people inside it were what mattered." Chase nodded slowly, turning that over. I heard the engine before I saw the vehicle, a black SUV that had been slowing for the pedestrian zone, suddenly accelerating hard, the sound of tires grabbing asphalt with violent purpose. I had less than a second to understand what was happening. Chase understood it faster than I did. His hands hit my shoulders, both of them hard, and shoved me sideways into the landscaping border. I went down onto my hands and knees in the mulch. The SUV clipped the edge of the path and kept going. The sound Chase made when he hit the concrete barrier was not something I will ever be able to unhear. I scrambled upright. He was on the ground 8 feet away, one hand pressed to his head, his face the color of chalk. Blood was coming through his fingers. "Chase." I was beside him before I knew I had moved both hands, pressing over his. "Chase, look at me. Look at me right now." He looked at me. His eyes were glassy but present, and he said in a voice thinner than any 15-year-old's voice should ever be, "Are you hurt?" I was bleeding onto the pavement, and he was asking if I was hurt. I pressed harder against the wound and looked up at the people already running toward us. Someone was on a phone. Someone was shouting for security. "I'm fine," I told him, even though my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep pressure on the wound. "I'm right here. You're going to be fine." The ambulance took 11 minutes. I rode with him, my hand over his the entire way, and I did not let go once. The emergency physician met us at the trauma bay doors. He looked at Chase, looked at the wound, looked at me. "We need to run a full panel," he said. Does anyone know the boy's blood type? Behind me, I heard Monica's heels on the linoleum. She had followed in her own car. She was already here, already composing her face into the right expression. She did not answer the doctor's question. The waiting room had that particular quality of stillness that only exists in hospitals. Not peaceful, not quiet, but suspended, like the moment between lightning and thunder, when you're holding your breath and counting. I had been in this hospital twice before. Once when Richard had a kidney stone in 2011 and spent 4 hours pretending it didn't hurt as badly as it did. Once when Chase was 7 and broke his collarbone falling out of a tree in our backyard. He had cried the whole drive over and then immediately stopped when the nurses gave him a popsicle. Richard had laughed about that for years. I was not laughing now. The attending physician, a young man whose name tag read Dr. Paul Garrett, came out of the trauma bay and found us in the corridor. He had the focused, slightly exhausted look of someone 3 hours into a 12-hour shift. Chase has a significant laceration on the left side of his head, he said, addressing me directly. We've controlled the bleeding, he's conscious and his responses are good. But his blood pressure is lower than I'd like, and given the blood loss, I want to run a transfusion to be safe. He looked between me, Monica, and Derek, who had arrived 20 minutes after the ambulance. We'll need his blood type. Do either of his parents know it offhand, or should we pull it from his records? Monica opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I can never remember it, she said. It's in his pediatrician's file. You should be able to pull it. Derek said nothing. He was standing against the wall with his arms crossed over his chest, staring at a point somewhere above the door to the trauma bay. His face had the gray, fixed quality of a man doing very careful arithmetic in his head and not liking the answer. Dr. Garrett nodded and went back inside. I sat down in one of the plastic chairs along the wall. Monica sat across from me, her phone already in her hand. Derek remained standing still, staring at nothing. The pediatric records came back in 12 minutes. Dr. Garrett reappeared with a tablet in his hand. AB negative, he said. Fairly rare, about 1% of the population. We have compatible units in the blood bank, so we're good to proceed. He looked at Monica. Just wanted to confirm before we moved forward. We'll keep him overnight for observation. He went back through the doors. AB negative. I looked at my hands folded in my lap, and I did the math the way I had done math my entire life, quietly, completely, without letting anything show on my face. Richard was type O. I knew this the way I knew his coffee order and the sound of his laugh from 41 years of proximity, from the blood donor card that had lived in his wallet since 1987, from the surgical paperwork I had signed when he had his gallbladder removed in 2004. I was type O, had been my entire life. 2 parents with type O blood can only produce a child with type O blood. It is not a matter of probability or medical exception. It is genetics fixed and absolute the same way 2 and 2 produces 4, regardless of how badly you need it to produce 5. Derek was type O. I had his childhood medical records in a box in our home office appendectomy at age 9, the forms I had filled out in the waiting room while Richard paced the hallway outside the surgical suite. Monica was type A. She had mentioned it herself at Thanksgiving 3 years ago when the company had run a blood drive and she had declined to participate. I'm type A, she had said, and I have a thing about needles. Small detail. The kind of thing you file away without knowing why. Type O father, type A mother. The possible outcomes for their child type A or type O. Not AB, never AB. The B allele had to come from somewhere, and it had not come from Derek Sterling, and it had not come from me, and it had not come from Richard. I raised my eyes and looked at Monica. She was typing on her phone, her thumb moving fast, her jaw set with a tension she was working hard to keep out of her expression. She was not texting a friend. She was not updating a family member. The speed of her fingers and the angle of her shoulders told me she was managing something containing something that had just cracked open in a way she had not planned for. I looked at Derek. He had finally stopped staring at the door. He was looking at the floor now, his arms still crossed, his shoulders pulled forward. There was sweat along his hairline that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. He was not confused. He was not curious about a statistical anomaly in his son's medical chart. He was terrified. The difference matters. I have sat across from confused people and terrified people in boardrooms for 40 years. Confused people ask questions. Terrified people go very, very still. Derek was not asking any questions. I stood up, smoothed my slacks, and walked to the end of the corridor far enough that my voice would not carry, and took out my phone. Robert Sanchez answered on the second ring. He was a former FBI agent who had spent 20 years dismantling white-collar criminal networks before moving into private investigation. He was 52 years old, completely humorless, and the most thorough person I had ever hired. "Robert," I said, keeping my voice low and even, "I need you to find out everything there is to know about Bradley Jenkins, CFO of Sterling Logistics, where he went to school, who he knew before he came to work for us, and anything that connects him to Monica Sterling. I need it fast, and I need it airtight." A brief pause. "How far back?" "As far as it goes," I said. I hung up and walked back to the waiting room. The doors to the trauma bay were still closed. Monica was still on her phone. Derek was still staring at the floor. And then the main doors to the ward slid open, and Bradley Jenkins walked in holding a gas station bouquet of white carnations, his face arranged into an expression of deep concern that did not reach his eyes. I saw Monica first. Something passed between them, fast, wordless, the fluency of people who have been communicating in shorthand for a very long time. Then he saw me watching. He recovered quickly, smiled, held up the flowers. "Evelyn," he said warmly. "I came as soon as I heard. How is the boy?" "Oh, stable," I said. "Thank you for coming, Bradley." I smiled back at him and said nothing else, but I did not look away. "Before I tell you what Robert found, and I promise you nothing could have prepared me for it, I need to know if you are still with me. Type "still here" in the comments right now. Every single comment means more to me than you know. Robert Sanchez had a rule. He told every client exactly once. He did not editorialize, he did not speculate, and he did not deliver partial information. When he called, it meant he had everything. He called 48 hours after I hired him. I was in Richard's study when the phone rang, sitting at his desk. Not mine, because the chair still smelled faintly like his aftershave, and I was not ready to give that up yet. Outside the window, the oak tree in the backyard had started dropping leaves. Richard had planted that tree the year Derek was born. He had measured it every autumn, proud as a man could be of something that grew without him having to tell it how. I answered on the first ring. "Start with Bradley Jenkins," Robert said. No greeting. That was how I knew it was serious. His name before he came to Sterling Logistics was Bradley Allen Jenkins. Born in Ohio, relocated to Connecticut for college. Westbrook College class of 2009. He paused one beat. "Monica Hargrove, her name before she married your son, graduated from Westbrook College in the same year. Same program. I pulled their university records. They were in 4 classes together. They shared an off-campus apartment for 2 years. "They've known each other for 19 years, I said. "They've been together for 19 years, Robert said. "There's a distinction. I have credit card records, hotel receipts, and a private dining reservation made 2 weeks before Richard died at a restaurant in Westport. Corner table, 2 hours cash tip. I also have something else." I heard him move papers. Bradley Jenkins left a coffee cup in the hospital waiting room the night Chase was admitted. Disposable cup touched the rim. I retrieved it before housekeeping did. I sent it to a private lab along with the swab from the bloody towel Chase used after the accident. Another pause. Bradley Jenkins is Chase's biological father. The result is conclusive. 0 margin of error. I set down the pen I had been holding. My hand was steady. I made sure of it. "The digitalis," I said. 3 weeks before Richard's death, a transaction appeared on a credit card registered to Monica Sterling, a secondary card, not the one she uses for household expenses. The purchase was made at a compounding pharmacy in Bridgeport, Digitalis Compound, which is a controlled preparation of cardiac glycoside. Robert's voice stayed flat and professional, the way a surgeon's hands stay flat and professional. "The pharmacy keeps records. The prescription was written by a physician whose license was suspended in 2019. I have the receipt." Outside, a gust of wind pulled a fistful of leaves from Richard's oak tree and scattered them across the lawn. He had known. He had been standing in this same room, sitting in this same chair, looking out at that same tree, and he had known something was wrong, had written 11 words on a piece of paper and hidden them behind our wedding photograph, and then he had run out of time. I pressed my hand flat against the surface of his desk. "There's one more thing," Robert said, "and I want you to hear it before I send the file." "Go ahead." I pulled Derek's medical records from his college years. It required some effort, but they exist. At age 23, Derek contracted a viral infection that caused permanent damage to his reproductive system. His treating physician at the time documented it clearly irreversible sterility. Robert stopped. He has known since he was 23 years old that he could not father a child. The room did not spin. I had been in business long enough to know that the truth, when it finally arrives, rarely feels like a surprise. It feels like confirmation, the last piece of an equation clicking into place. My son had known for 15 years. He had watched me love Chase, watched Richard build a future around that boy, watched us pour our hearts into a legacy we believed was ours, and he had said nothing. Because saying something would have cost him his inheritance. Because silence was cheaper than honesty, and Derek had always preferred the path that cost him least. I was still sitting with that when my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Unknown number. Local area code different from Dr. Whitfield's. I answered it. Mrs. Sterling. The voice was older female, fraying slightly at the edges, with the specific texture of someone who had been crying recently and was trying to hold it together. This is Maggie Cole. I'm so sorry to call. I didn't know if I should, but I haven't been able to sleep, and I think you need to know what I saw. Tell me, I said. 2 weeks before Mr. Sterling passed. She stopped, steadied herself. I had forgotten my reading glasses in the office. I went back to get them around 11 at night. The building should have been empty. Her voice dropped. Monica and Bradley Jenkins were in Richard's office, together. I saw them through the glass panel. I don't know what they were doing, I didn't go in, but they were at his desk, and one of them had the bottom drawer open. The bottom drawer, the one that had been standing open when I arrived 2 days ago. I should have said something immediately, Maggie said, and now she was crying in earnest, the kind of crying that had been building for days. I was frightened. I didn't know who to tell or whether anyone would believe me. Richard was always so kind to me, and I'm so sorry, Mrs. Sterling. I am so sorry. Maggie, I said, you're telling me now. That's what matters. I need you to write down exactly what you saw, time date what you observed, and I need you to send it to an attorney named Victor Lang. I'll text you his address. She agreed, still crying, and I ended the call. I sat for a long moment in Richard's chair in Richard's study, with the oak tree losing its leaves outside and 3 separate threads. Bradley's DNA, Monica's pharmacy receipt, Maggie's testimony wound together into something that was no longer a suspicion. It was a case. I opened my contacts and found Victor Lang's number. I called Victor Lang that night and gave him everything Robert had found. He told me he would need until Thursday. That gave me 1 day to do something I had been putting off since the moment Robert's file landed on Richard's desk. There are things you know about your children that they don't realize you know. I knew Derek slept with the television on until he was 14 because the dark frightened him. I knew he cried for 2 days when his first dog died but pretended he hadn't. I knew the specific way his jaw tightened when he was lying, a small, almost imperceptible clench just below his left ear, the same tell he'd had since he was 9 years old, and tried to convince me he hadn't broken the kitchen window with a baseball. He was 42 years old. The tell was still there. I called him on a Tuesday evening when I knew Monica had her weekly dinner with her real estate attorney, a standing appointment she kept every Tuesday without fail. Derek answered on the 3rd ring, his voice carrying that particular careful warmth he deployed whenever he was uncertain what I wanted. "Mom, how are you holding up?" "I need to come by," I said. "There are some things I want to discuss before Friday, just the 2 of us." A pause, brief, but I felt the weight of it. "Of course," he said. "Come whenever you're ready." He answered the door in a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up, holding a glass of bourbon that was not his first of the evening. The house was large and expensively decorated Brazilian cherry floors, custom millwork, a kitchen that had been featured in an architectural magazine 2 years ago. Richard and I had written the down payment check without hesitation. We had believed we were building a foundation for our son's family. I followed him to the living room and sat down across from him. He lowered himself into the armchair across from me, the way a man sits when he's bracing for impact, but is trying not to show it. I did not ease into it. I had not driven across town on a Tuesday night to ease into anything. I opened my bag and placed 3 things on the coffee table between us. The photograph first, Robert's surveillance image of Monica and Bradley at the Westport restaurant, their hands close on the table, Bradley leaning in with the unconscious ease of a man, entirely comfortable with the woman across from him. The Digitalist pharmacy receipt second, the DNA result, 3rd 1-page clinical language, Bradley Jenkins confirmed as the biological father of Chase Sterling. Probability 100%. Derek looked at the 3 items on the table. He did not pick any of them up. He took a long pull of his bourbon instead, and when he set the glass down, his hand left a slight tremor in the liquid. "Derek," I said, "I'm going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Not for my sake, for yours." He said nothing. The jaw muscle flickered. "Did you know Monica and Bradley had a relationship before she married you?" The silence lasted 4 seconds, long enough that the answer was already clear before he spoke. "Not before," he said finally. His voice had gone rough and low. "I found out about 2 years in. She told me it was over. that it had been a mistake. He stopped. I believed her because I wanted to. And Chase? Derek set the bourbon glass down on the side table and pressed both hands against his knees. His shoulders curved forward like a man trying to make himself smaller than he was. I knew about my medical condition from college, he said, his voice cracking on the words. But when Monica got pregnant, she convinced me it was a medical miracle. I wanted so badly to believe her that I stayed blind. Then the blood type came up during a 3-month pediatric appointment, AB negative. I went home and finally stopped lying to myself. And you said nothing. I confronted Monica. His hands pressed harder against his knees. She told me that if I said a word, if I told you or Dad or anyone, she would tell you about my condition. That she would tell you I was sterile, that I had known since I was 23, that I had let you and Dad believe all those years, that the reason we hadn't had children sooner was simply timing. He looked up at me for the first time, his eyes red at the rims. She said you would cut me out of everything. She said Dad would never forgive me for the deception. I looked at my son. This man. I had raised this boy. I had loved without condition or caveat for 42 years, and I felt something that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but lived in the territory between them. She was right that I would have been hurt, I said carefully. She was wrong about what I would have done. Derek flinched as though I had struck him. I told myself it didn't matter, he said quietly. Chase is a good kid. I told myself I was still his father where it counted, that the biology was just a technicality. His voice broke on the last word. I told myself a lot of things for 15 years. I reached into my bag and removed the final item, a printed email. Robert had retrieved it from a server backup. It was dated 6 days before Richard died, sent from Derek's personal account to Monica's. I placed it on the table facing him. He looked down at it. His own words stared back at him in plain black text. Monica, how much longer do we have to wait? He isn't changing his mind about the succession structure. We need this to move. The color left his face completely. Derek. I kept my voice level, though what I felt underneath it was anything but. I'm not asking whether you knew exactly what they planned to do to your father, but I am telling you that this email exists, that a federal investigator has seen it, and that the question of what you knew and when you knew it will be answered in a courtroom if you do not make a different choice right now. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. His shoulders were shaking. I didn't know they were going to... He stopped, started again. I knew Monica wanted things to move faster. I knew she was frustrated. I told myself I thought she meant she was going to pressure him differently. Talk to the board. I didn't think, you didn't ask, I said. That's not the same as not knowing Derek. You sent that email. You knew something was coming. You chose not to ask what it was because if you didn't ask, you didn't have to answer for it. The room was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. Derek lowered his face into his hands and wept, not the controlled, performative tears he had deployed in the boardroom, but something ragged and ugly and entirely real. The sound of a man who had spent 15 years building a wall between himself and the truth, and had just watched it come down in an evening. I waited until the worst of it passed. Then I stood, smoothed my jacket, and placed all 4 items back into my bag. You have one chance to do the right thing, I said. 1. Whatever that looks like, I'll leave that to your conscience. I walked to the door and paused with my hand on the frame. I'll tell you this much, Derek. Your father loved you completely and without reservation for 42 years. He deserved better than what this family gave him in the end. So did you, if you'd only had the courage to demand it. I let myself out into the cool night air and did not look back. Richard used to say that the best time to deliver a decisive blow is the moment your opponent believes the fight is already over. I had taught him that. 30 years later, I was about to use it. Victor Lang's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, all glass and clean lines and the particular quiet that expensive square footage buys. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, and had the focused stillness of a man who had spent 3 decades in courtrooms and learned that composure was its own form of power. He did not offer condolences when I sat down. We had known each other too long for that. I placed Robert's full file on his desk, the photographs, the pharmacy receipt, the DNA results. Maggie Cole's written statement, Derek's email, and watched him read through it without a word. When he finished, he looked up. I'll contact Carol Hayes this afternoon, he said. She's the lead agent on financial crimes at the field office. I've worked against her twice. She's thorough, and she doesn't make mistakes. He closed the folder. We can have arrest warrants ready by Thursday evening. Murder, conspiracy, financial fraud, the full weight of it. I want it done at the board meeting, I said. Friday morning, in that room. Victor studied me for a moment. Then he nodded once. I'll make the arrangements. Agent Carol Hayes arrived at Victor's office an hour later, 45 years old, dark suit, the kind of handshake that told you immediately she was not interested in being underestimated. She reviewed the file with the systematic efficiency of someone who had built federal cases from thinner material than this, and won. We'll have agents positioned outside the building from 6 a.m., she said. The warrants will be signed by a federal judge Thursday night. She looked at me directly. Mrs. Sterling, I need you to go into that room Friday morning and act as though you have no idea what's coming. Can you do that? I've been doing it all week, I said. That evening I went to the hospital. Chase was sitting up in bed, the bandage on his head reduced to a smaller dressing, a textbook open across his lap that he was clearly not reading. He looked up when I came in, and the relief on his face was so unguarded it made my chest ache. We talked for a while about nothing important. The hospital food, a show he'd been watching on his phone, whether the oak tree in our backyard had finished losing its leaves yet. Then he closed the textbook and looked at me with Richard's particular directness, the kind that skipped the surface and went straight to the point. Grandma, are you going to be okay? I thought about Victor's office, about Agent Hayes, about Friday morning and everything it would bring down. I've been okay since 1985, I said. I'm not stopping now. He reached out and held my hand the way Richard used to, not dramatically, just steadily, the way you hold something you intend to keep. I stayed until visiting hours ended. In the parking garage afterward, I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. I reached into my bag and found the black blazer folded there, the one I had worn the day Richard and I signed our first $1 million contract 31 years ago. I had brought it without entirely deciding to. Tomorrow I would go home and press it carefully. Friday I would wear it into that boardroom, not as a widow, not as a grieving mother, as the woman who built Sterling Logistics from nothing and who was about to take it back. The boardroom looked different on Friday morning. Or perhaps I was the one who looked different. It amounts to the same thing. Monica had arranged the room the way she arranged everything, with meticulous attention to appearance and absolute disregard for substance. Fresh flowers on the credenza, new chairs for the board members Bradley had installed, her own name placard at the head of the table where Richard's had been for 35 years. She was already seated when I arrived, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than our first delivery truck. Her hands folded with the composure of a woman who believed the hard part was behind her. Derek sat to her right. He looked like a man who hadn't slept. Good. Bradley was at the far end, his leather portfolio open in front of him, a pen in his hand. He glanced up when I walked in and offered me the particular smile of someone who believes they have already won. I sat down at the opposite end of the table and folded my hands. Monica let the silence build for exactly the right amount of time. She was good at that. I would give her that much. And then she slid the succession agreement down the length of the table. It stopped in front of me, the same document, the same gold pen resting on top. We're all here, Evelyn, she said, whenever you're ready. I looked at the pen. I looked at Derek. For one long moment I held his gaze and gave him what I had promised, one chance. His jaw worked. His hands tightened on the edge of the table. Then he looked away. I released the pen without touching it and sat back in my chair. No, I said. The door opened. Victor Lang walked in first, his briefcase clasped in both hands, his expression the professional blankness of a man about to dismantle something carefully built. Agent Carol Hayes came in behind him, and 2 FBI agents in dark jackets filed in after her and took positions on either side of the room without a word. The board members went very still. Victor set his briefcase on the table, opened it, and removed 3 documents. He placed them in a row on the polished mahogany. The DNA result, the pharmacy receipt, Maggie Cole's signed statement with the quiet deliberateness of a man laying out surgical instruments. The DNA analysis confirms that Bradley Jenkins is the biological father of Chase Sterling, Victor said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. Monica Sterling purchased Digitalis Compound from a compounding pharmacy in Bridgeport 3 weeks before Richard Sterling's death. A witness places both Monica Sterling and Bradley Jenkins in Richard Sterling's private office at 11 p.m. 2 weeks before his death. He looked at Monica. Federal warrants have been issued for the arrest of Monica Sterling and Bradley Jenkins on charges of murder in the first-degree attempted murder, conspiracy, and financial fraud. Monica stood up so fast, her chair rolled back and hit the wall. You cannot, she started. Mrs. Sterling. Agent Hayes stepped forward. "Please place your hands on the table." What happened next took less than 2 minutes. Bradley did not resist. He set his pen down with the careful movements of a man whose mind was already somewhere else entirely, somewhere gray and institutional, and very far from this room. Monica fought it, her voice rising, her composure finally and completely gone, saying things about what she deserved and what she had sacrificed and how many years she had given to this family. I did not watch her being let out. I watched Derek instead. I was still sitting in his chair. He had not moved through any of it. When Agent Hayes approached him with the third warrant conspiracy accessory, he stood without being asked, held out his wrists, and did not say a single word. He looked at me once, just before they led him through the door. I did not look away. The room emptied. The door closed. Thomas Briggs appeared from the side entrance, moving quietly the way he always had, and set a cup of coffee on the table in front of me. 2 sugars, no cream. Richard's order. My order. 40 years of mornings. "Welcome back, Mrs. Sterling," he said. I wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the head of the table at Richard's chair, empty now, returned to what it had always been. Outside, the Sterling logistics trucks were already moving through the city. They had never stopped. 6 months is not a long time. It is, however, enough time for the truth to finish what it started. The family court process began in the weeks immediately after the arrests. Bradley, facing 20 years and the complete destruction of everything he had built, signed the termination of parental rights without negotiation. His attorney filed the paperwork on a Tuesday. By March, Chase Sterling was legally my son. The court had expedited the kinship adoption family of record, not just a feeling. The paperwork caught up to what was already true. Not by blood, by choice, which, as it turns out, is the harder thing to come by and the more durable when you find it. Hi is 16 now. He drives me to the office on Wednesday mornings because I let him practice on the quieter roads, and he takes it very seriously, both hands on the wheel, checking his mirrors the way I taught him. Last week he told me he wants to study logistics management. I told him I might know someone who could help with that. Thomas Briggs is back at his desk on the operations floor, doing the work he should never have been pulled from. Maggie Cole makes the coffee every morning, 2 sugars, no cream, and sets it on the corner of my desk without being asked. Some mornings I have to take a breath before I pick it up. Some mornings it is the easiest thing in the world. I thank God for both kinds of mornings because Richard taught me that the ones that cost you something are the ones worth having. We established the Richard Sterling Memorial Fund in September, full university scholarships for the children of Sterling Logistics employees, renewable, for 4 years, no strings attached. The first 3 recipients were announced at the company meeting last month. I stood at the podium and looked out at the people who had kept this company moving through everything. The drivers, the coordinators, the warehouse managers who had shown up every morning regardless of what was happening on the executive floor, and I felt something I had not expected to feel so soon. Grateful, completely and quietly and genuinely grateful. I thanked God for every one of them. The last note Richard left me is framed now on the wall of my office beside our wedding photograph. 11 words and a name. It is the last thing I look at when I leave every evening. On the roof of the Sterling Logistics building, on the first cool morning of October, Chase found me standing at the railing looking out at the city. He came and stood beside me without being asked, the way he does most things now, quietly, steadily, with the particular ease of someone who has decided where he belongs. He did not say anything for a while, neither did I. We watched the Sterling trucks move through the streets below the same routes Richard had mapped 30 years ago, still running. "Do you miss him?" Chase asked finally. "Every single day," I said. He nodded. Then he reached over and held my hand the same way he had in the hospital bed, steady and without hesitation, the way you hold something you have already decided belongs to you. Monica and Bradley were sentenced on a Thursday morning in November, 20 years each federal penitentiary, no possibility of early release on the murder conspiracy charge. I sat in the 4th row of the courtroom and watched the judge deliver the sentence with the measured finality of a man who had seen enough human recklessness to be neither surprised nor moved by it. Monica did not look at me when they let her out. Bradley looked at the floor. I had nothing left to say to either of them, so I said nothing, and I thanked God that Richard had not lived to sit in that room. Derek received 8 years conspiracy and accessory after the fact. He stood when the judge read the sentence and did not flinch. Whatever else he was, he had found at the very end some small reserve of dignity. I prayed he would use the time to locate more of it. Blood doesn't make a family. Loyalty does. Love does. And sometimes the child who saves your life turns out to be more yours than you ever could have planned. I almost lost everything because I trusted the wrong people for the right reasons. Do not make my mistake. Watch what the people at your table do when they think no one is looking. That is who they really are. These family revenge stories are easy to reduce to courtrooms and handcuffs. But what stays with me is simpler. A 15-year-old boy held my hand in a hospital bed and asked if I was hurt. I believe God placed him in front of me for a reason. That is the whole story. Everything else was just the road that led me back to it. Love when it is real does not wait for paperwork. And loyalty when it is genuine does not need a last name to prove itself. If these revenge stories with a strong woman at the center feel like something you have lived, leave a comment. I read every single one. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that it is never too late to fight for what matters. And if you believe that family is built by choice, not just by blood, subscribe. We will be here. Thank you for staying until the very end. A gentle note before you go. Some stories on this channel include fictional elements shaped with intention and shared in the hope that they remind us what truly matters. If that is not for you, no judgment at all. But if you are still here, I think you already know why you stayed.